The crystal champagne flutes chimed like a chorus of tiny, hopeful bells, a sound that was supposed to signify joy. For Liam, they sounded like a countdown. He stood beside his bride, Isabel, the scent of 1,000 white roses mingling with the expensive perfume of their guests. She was radiant, a vision in ivory silk, her smile as bright and sharp as the diamonds at her throat. She had never looked more beautiful, and he had never felt a more profound sense of dread. The band finished their song, and instead of the DJ starting the next track, a silence fell over the grand ballroom. It was a heavy, expectant quiet. Isabel picked up a microphone, her smile unwavering. "Thank you all for being here on the most important day of my life," she began, her voice smooth as cream. "As many of you know, the last 2 years have been a whirlwind. Building my company, Innovate, from the ground up has been my entire world." A ripple of appreciative applause went through the crowd, a sea of tailored suits and designer dresses. Her father, Richard, beamed from the head table, looking every bit the proud patriarch of a new dynasty. "And in that time," Isabel continued, turning to Liam, "I found love. Liam has been my quiet support, my calm in the storm." Her words were honeyed, but her eyes held a different message. It was a look of gentle, patronizing ownership. Liam felt the familiar prickle of humiliation, but he kept his expression serene, a mask of loving adoration he had perfected over the last year. "But as a businesswoman," she said, her tone shifting, becoming more resolute, "I've learned that prudence is just as important as passion." Her gaze swept the room, landing on her father, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. From a silk clutch, she produced a sheaf of papers, bound in a crisp, blue legal cover. "Which is why, before we cut the cake and truly begin our lives together, there's just one small piece of business." She held the documents out to him. A prenuptial agreement. At their wedding reception, in front of 200 of their friends, family, and her business associates. A collective gasp, quickly suppressed, was a wave of sound that washed over him. He could feel the stares, a mixture of pity, curiosity, and smug satisfaction from her side of the family. He saw her mother, Eleanor, give a tight, apologetic smile, a silent enabler to her daughter's theatrical power play. Isabel thought she was protecting her future. She thought she was insulating the small, brilliant fortune she had built from the simple, unassuming architect she had chosen to marry. She believed she was the sun, and he was a minor planet caught in her orbit, lucky to be warmed by her glow. What she didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that the sun they all orbited was in fact him, the seed money, the foundational investment that had allowed Innovate to exist. The $2 million she believed had come from a shrewd, anonymous venture capital firm had come from his own private wealth. He wasn't just the architect of buildings, he was the silent architect of her entire success. Within 6 months, this document, this public spectacle of humiliation, would become the very instrument of her downfall. The irony was so thick, so potent, it was almost a physical taste in his mouth, more bitter than the champagne they had just toasted with. We've all seen moments where power dynamics are put on public display, haven't we? It's fascinating and sometimes heartbreaking to watch. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love to see how far these stories travel. Now let's get back to the ballroom, where Liam held a pen in his hand, and the future of his marriage was about to be signed away, though not in the way anyone imagined. Liam took the papers from her. His hand was perfectly steady. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at the document. He could feel her confidence, a radiant heat coming off her. She believed this was her coronation, the moment she secured her queendom. "Of course, my love," he said, his voice quiet but clear, carrying through the silent room. He clicked the pen. He signed his name on the indicated line without reading a single clause. He knew, in essence, what it would say. What was hers was hers. He was entitled to nothing. It was a declaration of her independence and his perceived dependence. He slid the document and the pen back onto the table. Then he looked up and met her eyes. He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that didn't quite reach his own. "Is that all?" The room exhaled. The tension broke. Isabel, momentarily thrown by his utter lack of resistance, recovered quickly. She laughed, a tinkling, relieved sound. "That's all," she said, leaning in to kiss his cheek. The kiss felt cold. The band, taking their cue, struck up a lively tune. The chatter returned, louder now, buzzing with the gossip of what had just transpired. The waiters began to move again, pouring more champagne. The moment had passed. But for Liam, it had just begun. It was a declaration of war, signed and sealed with a kiss. He had accepted the terms, and he would win. Because the one thing Isabel and her family had never bothered to understand was that in a game of strategy, the quietest player is often the most dangerous. He had patiently built the board they were all playing on. Now he would simply begin to move the pieces. The rest of the wedding reception passed in a blur of forced smiles and hollow congratulations. Guests from his side offered quiet, sympathetic glances, their handshakes lingering a moment too long. Guests from her side, particularly her business contacts, looked at him with a new, dismissive curiosity, as if he were a piece of modern art they didn't quite understand, but were certain wasn't worth much. He was no longer just Liam, the charming architect. He was Liam, the man who had been publicly neutered at his own wedding. He played his part perfectly, dancing with his new wife, laughing at her father's booming jokes, and thanking everyone for coming. But beneath the calm facade, a cold, clear resolve was hardening, like steel being quenched in ice water. Their honeymoon in Bali was less a romantic escape and more a 2-week performance piece. Isabel was incandescently happy, flush with the triumph of having secured her assets and her man. She saw the signing of the prenup not as an insult, but as a final, tidy piece of administration that allowed her to relax fully into the role of a wife. She treated Liam with an affectionate indulgence, like a beloved pet she could now afford to pamper. She bought him expensive clothes he didn't want and praised his simple, grounded nature to other wealthy couples they met at the resort, as if his lack of visible ambition was a quaint, charming accessory to her own soaring success. The true test came when they returned. They moved into the sleek, minimalist house Isabel had bought with her first wave of profits, a house of glass and white marble that felt more like a corporate lobby than a home. It was her creation, her domain, and he was merely a resident. Within a week, Richard and Eleanor invited them for a welcome home dinner. It was there that the subtle campaign of diminishment began in earnest. The dining room of Richard and Eleanor's home was opulent, heavy with dark wood, oil paintings, and the weight of old money aspirations funded by new money realities. Richard, a man whose own business ventures had been a series of respectable mediocrities before his daughter hit the jackpot, poured an expensive Bordeaux and settled back in his chair, fixing Liam with a look of magnanimous interest. "So, Liam," he began, the picture of a concerned father-in-law, "now that Isabel is, well, where she is, have you given any thought to your own career trajectory?" Liam placed his napkin on his lap. "I'm quite happy where I am, Richard. My firm has several interesting projects lined up." Richard chuckled, a low, condescending rumble. "Projects, yes. Blueprints and scale models. Quaint. But what's the end game? You're an intelligent young man. Surely you don't want to be drawing lines on paper for the rest of your life while your wife is conquering the tech world." "I find a great deal of satisfaction in creating spaces that people live and work in," Liam said evenly, his voice a calm counterpoint to Richard's booming tone. "Satisfaction doesn't pay for a second home in the Hamptons," Richard shot back, winking at Isabel. "Listen, what I'm saying is, there might be a place for you at Innovate, in logistics maybe, or facilities management, something to get you in the game, you know? We need people we can trust." The offer hung in the air, thick with unspoken insult. He wasn't being offered a job. He was being offered a handout, a position to keep him busy, to make him feel a part of his wife's world, a role befitting a consort rather than a partner. Eleanor shifted uncomfortably, her fork clinking against her plate, but said nothing. Isabel, to her credit, looked slightly embarrassed. "Dad, Liam has his own career," she said, though her defense was weak, lacking conviction. "I'm just thinking of the future," Richard boomed. "Of the family. We've got to protect what you've built, Izzy, and that means making sure everyone is pulling in the same direction." His eyes flickered to Liam. "And that everyone is appropriately situated." Liam felt a familiar, hot surge of anger, but he let it cool before it reached his face. He looked at Richard, then at Isabel. He gave a small, self-deprecating smile. "It's a generous thought, Richard. Thank you. But I think for now, I'm more useful to Isabel by ensuring our home life is stable and calm, so she can focus on conquering the world." He had deliberately used her own words, calm in the storm, and turned them into a shield. It was the answer they wanted to hear, the answer that confirmed their perception of him as the docile, supportive spouse. Richard beamed, his point made. Isabel relaxed, the faint blush of embarrassment on her cheeks receding. She reached across the table and squeezed Liam's hand. "And I appreciate that so much, darling," she said. Later that night, long after Isabel had fallen asleep in their cold white bedroom, Liam went to his study. It was the one room in the house he had claimed as his own, filled with books on architectural theory, rolls of drafting paper, and the warm scent of wood and graphite. It was his sanctuary, his fortress of solitude. He closed the door, the sound of the latch clicking shut a small, satisfying punctuation mark. He sat at his desk and powered on his secondary laptop, a sleek, encrypted device that Isabel had never seen. He logged into a series of secure portals, his fingers moving with practiced speed. The screen filled not with blueprints, but with complex financial statements, stock tickers, and investment portfolios that dwarfed Isabel's entire company valuation several times over. This was his real work, the source of the quiet, immense wealth he had inherited and carefully cultivated since his early 20s. He was the sole proprietor of the Orion Holdings Group, a private equity firm so discreet it was practically a ghost, known only to a handful of elite financial circles. He opened a specific folder labeled Project Nightingale. Inside was a single, multi-page PDF. It was the original seed funding agreement for a company called Innovate. He scrolled down to the signature page. There, beside Isabel's triumphant, looping signature, was the crisp, authorized stamp of Orion Holdings, and beneath it, a signature for the authorizing officer. The name was unfamiliar, a proxy he used for such transactions, but the power behind it flowed directly from him. He leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking in the silent house. This document was the symbolic object of his secret life, the tangible proof of the vast, galling irony that defined his marriage. He had given her the ladder, and the moment she reached the top, she had turned and tried to kick it away, not realizing his hand was still holding it steady. He looked at the document for a long time, the anger from dinner solidifying into something harder, colder. It wasn't about the money, it was, and had always been, about respect, and he would now methodically, patiently, and devastatingly teach her its meaning. The humiliation he felt was a fuel, and he had a very, very long journey to plan. The months that followed the wedding unfolded like a slow, deliberate tightening of a knot. Isabel's company didn't just grow, it exploded. A feature in a major business magazine had painted her as the tech world's new visionary, a brilliant, beautiful wunderkind who had bootstrapped her way to stardom. The article conveniently glossed over the source of her initial funding, describing it vaguely as a prescient early-stage investment from a forward-thinking venture capital firm. Isabel began to speak of this anonymous firm with a kind of reverence, as if they were divine patrons who had recognized her genius from on high. It never once occurred to her to investigate who they actually were, Her ego, fed by a constant diet of praise and success, had no room for such questions. With her rising fame came a proportional rise in her arrogance. She started making decisions about their life with the same unilateral authority she wielded in her boardroom. One afternoon, Liam came home from a difficult site visit to find a sleek, ridiculously expensive sports car in the driveway, a massive red bow on its hood. "Surprise!" Isabel had chirped, kissing him on the cheek. "It's for you. I can't have my husband driving that sensible old sedan anymore. It's bad for the brand." He looked at the car, a monument to ostentatious wealth that was everything he wasn't. "Isabel, this is too much. We didn't discuss this." She waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, don't be so serious, Liam. I can afford it. Just enjoy it." She didn't see it as a partnership decision. She saw it as a gift from a superior to a subordinate, a perk of being married to her. The sedan, a car he loved for its reliability and understated comfort, was gone. She had traded it in without asking. The parties became more frequent and more unbearable. They were not gatherings of friends, but networking events staged in their own home. Isabel would glide through the rooms, a queen in her court, while Liam was expected to trail in her wake, a handsome, silent consort. He became adept at the polite, non-committal smile, the quiet nod, the art of being present but invisible. The humiliation was a constant, low-grade fever. The worst of it came at their housewarming party, a grand affair to, officially, celebrate the home she had bought. A man named Marcus Thorne, a potential investor Isabel was trying to court, cornered Liam by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "So," Marcus said, swirling his brandy, "Isabel is a force of nature, absolutely brilliant. What is it you do, Liam?" The question was casual, but the underlying assumption was clear. Whatever it was, it couldn't possibly compare. Before Liam could formulate a response, Isabel swept in, placing a proprietary hand on his arm. She laughed, a light, musical sound that set his teeth on edge. "Oh, Marcus, don't put him on the spot," she said, her smile wide and dazzling. "Liam is my rock. He keeps the home fires burning while I'm out slaying dragons. I couldn't do it without him." She squeezed his arm, a gesture that was meant to look affectionate, but felt like a leash being tugged. The insult was perfectly crafted, a masterpiece of public diminishment wrapped in the language of love. She had reduced his entire identity, his career as a skilled and respected architect, his very personhood, to that of a house husband. Marcus Thorne nodded, his assessment of Liam clearly complete. He was the helpmeet, the supportive spouse, a soft place for the brilliant warrior to land. He turned his attention back to Isabel, the real power in the room, and Liam was left standing alone, the city lights glittering mockingly behind him. He took a slow sip of his water, the cold liquid doing nothing to extinguish the fire in his gut. He excused himself moments later, pleading a headache. He went not to their bedroom, but to his study, the fortress, the one place his identity remained whole. He didn't turn on his financial laptop. Instead, he sat in the dark, the sounds of the party a distant, muffled beat. He thought about the original plans for Innovate. He had helped her with them, late at night in his old apartment, back when she was just a girl with a powerful idea and no resources. He had listened to her dreams, and with his quiet, methodical mind, he had helped her shape them into a viable business model. He had asked the hard questions, stress-tested the assumptions, and helped her build the very framework of her proposal. She had taken that framework, that blueprint, and presented it as her own singular genius. He had allowed it because he loved her, and her success was his joy. But that was before the public prenup, before the condescension of her father, before being reduced to the rock who keeps the home fires burning. Love, he was learning, could not survive without the oxygen of respect, and his was suffocating. The next day he called David Chen, his lawyer and the closest thing he had to a confidant. David was the managing partner of the law firm that handled all of Orion Holdings' affairs. He was sharp, discreet, and utterly loyal. They met at a quiet, old-world hotel bar, the kind of place with dark wood paneling and bartenders who knew your drink before you ordered. "She traded in his car without asking?" David said, shaking his head after Liam recounted the latest incidents. "That's not a marriage, Liam. That's a hostile takeover." "It's a pattern of behavior," Liam said, his voice low. "A belief that her success gives her absolute authority, not just in her business, but in our life. She's blind to it." "And the prenup," David mused, steepling his fingers. "Theatrically, it was a masterstroke of cruelty. Legally, it's a fascinating document. It meticulously protects her declared assets, namely the current and future value of Innovate. It makes no claim on your assets because she assumes you don't have any to speak of." "The irony is a bit on the nose, isn't it?" Liam said with a dry, humorless smile. "It's more than ironic, Liam. It's a loaded gun she's pointed at her own foot," David said, his expression turning serious. "The question is, when do you want to help her pull the trigger?" Liam looked out the window. He was a builder. He created things that lasted, foundations of stone and steel. He had tried to build a marriage on a foundation of love, trust, and mutual respect. But he had discovered the ground was unstable. The materials he was given to work with were flawed. Now he had to switch disciplines. He was no longer building, he was planning a demolition. "Not yet," Liam said softly. "An architect knows that you can't begin deconstruction until you have a complete survey of the existing structure. I need to understand every weak point. I need to prepare the site." He turned back to David, his eyes cold and clear as glass. "Get everything in order. Every transaction, every email, every note from those early planning stages. Trace the flow of funds from my primary accounts through Orion to her company's initial capitalization. I want a fortress of facts, David, an airtight case with no room for interpretation or denial. When the time comes, I don't want a battle. I want a surrender." David nodded slowly, a look of grim admiration on his face. "Consider it done. You just tell me when." The quiet preparation had begun. While Isabel was gracing magazine covers and giving keynote speeches about her meteoric rise, Liam was quietly, methodically, laying the explosive charges at the foundation of the empire she believed was hers alone. The next 3 months were a masterclass in patience and control. Liam played the role of the supportive husband with such convincing subtlety that even Isabel, wrapped in her cocoon of self-congratulation, felt a vague sense of gratitude. He attended her galas, smiling placidly from the sidelines. He listened to her endless monologues about corporate strategy, offering simple, encouraging words. He was a placid lake, reflecting her own brilliance back at her, and she never once suspected the powerful, unseen currents moving deep beneath the surface. Meanwhile, his work with David was meticulous. They assembled a dossier that was both a financial history and a tragic love story. It contained copies of his initial wire transfers to the holding company, Orion, and the subsequent identical wire transfers from Orion to Innovate's first business account. It included scanned pages from his old notebooks, filled with his handwriting, outlining the very business and marketing strategies Isabel had later pitched as her own. They even unearthed early email chains between Liam and Isabel, where he would gently guide her thinking. "Have you considered this revenue stream?" he'd written in one. "The logistics of this supply chain might be problematic. Perhaps a decentralized model would be more resilient," he'd suggested in another. Each one was a small, crucial brick in the foundation of her company, a brick she had long since forgotten he had laid. The breaking point, when it came, was not a sudden explosion, but a quiet, arrogant statement made on a Tuesday evening. Liam had just returned home, his hands still smudged with graphite from a marathon drafting session. He found Isabel in the living room with her father, both of them staring at a laptop with expressions of feverish excitement. The air was thick with the scent of impending victory. "Liam, perfect timing!" Isabel exclaimed, her eyes shining. "Sit down, we have incredible news." He sat, a sense of foreboding settling over him. Richard clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture of forced camaraderie. "Your wife is a genius, my boy, a flat-out genius." "We're going global," Isabel announced, her voice trembling with emotion. "We've been in talks with a major European distribution network, but to meet their demands, we need to scale up production, fast. We need a new facility, new equipment. It's a massive expansion." "It requires a massive infusion of capital," Richard added, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We've secured a bridge loan from the bank, a very substantial one. It's all happening." Liam kept his expression neutral. "That's a big step. Congratulations. Have you secured the full funding for the expansion?" Isabel and Richard exchanged a look, a brief, silent communication that excluded him completely. "Not quite," Isabel said carefully. "The investors for the next round of funding are almost there, but they want to see us break ground on the new facility first. It's a sign of commitment, so the bank loan is critical to get the ball rolling." "And what's the collateral for a loan that size?" Liam asked, the question simple, direct. Isabel hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Well, that's the other part of the news," she said, forcing a bright smile. "The bank was so impressed with our portfolio and our personal assets. They were happy to accept the house as part of the collateral package." Silence. The grand, cold, marble house she had bought. The house that was, legally, their shared marital home, even if it felt like hers. She was leveraging their home to fund her business, a business he secretly owned, without a single word of discussion. Liam took a slow breath. "Isabel," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "you've put our home up as collateral for a business loan without consulting me?" Richard let out a short, barking laugh. "Consulting you? Liam, with all due respect, what would you know about high finance? Stick to your blueprints. This is the big league. It's a formality." The raw, unvarnished contempt in her father's voice was staggering, but it was Isabel's response that landed the final, fatal blow. She placed a hand on his, her touch meant to be soothing, placating. "Darling, don't look so worried," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "It's perfectly safe. And besides," she added, delivering the line with a triumphant little smile, "the prenup protects you from any of this risk. If anything goes wrong, you're completely insulated. See, I'm always looking out for you." There it was, the ultimate insult. The prenup, her sword of Damocles, was now being presented as his shield. His humiliation was reframed as her protection. His exclusion was a gift. In that moment, something inside Liam snapped, not with a crack, but with a quiet, final click, like a lock falling into place. The time for patience was over. The time for observation was over. The survey of the structure was complete. He looked from Isabel's confident, smiling face to Richard's smug, dismissive one. They saw him as a fool, a passenger, a nobody. They had no idea they were standing on a carefully constructed stage, and he was the one in the wings with his hand on the master switch. He stood up. "Excuse me," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "I need to make a phone call." He walked away, leaving them to their celebration. He went to his study, the one place he could breathe. He stood by the window, looking out at the city lights that had once seemed to mock him. Now, they looked like a promise. He took out his phone and dialed. David answered on the first ring. "David," Liam said, his voice as calm and as cold as the glass against his forehead. "It's time." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then David's voice came back, low and steady. "The boardroom at 10 a.m. tomorrow? Their big pitch to the Veyron Group?" "Yes," Liam said. "Have the packages ready. I'll meet you there." He hung up. The quiet before the storm had ended. The wind was beginning to rise. The boardroom on the 45th floor of the Innovate headquarters was Isabel's cathedral. It was a space designed to intimidate and impress, with a single, massive slab of polished mahogany for a table and floor-to-ceiling windows offering a godlike view of the city below. Today it was the stage for her greatest triumph. Seated around the table were the four existing members of her board, her father Richard looking puffed up with pride, and, most importantly, the three stern-faced representatives from the Veyron Group, the European investors whose partnership would catapult her company into the global stratosphere. Isabel was in her element. She commanded the room, her presentation a seamless blend of hard data and visionary rhetoric. She spoke of market penetration, supply chain logistics, and quarterly growth projections with a fluency that was undeniably impressive. She was poised, powerful, and utterly confident. The Veyron representatives were visibly impressed, their stoic expressions softening into nods of approval. The deal was all but done. And so, Isabel concluded, her voice ringing with passion, with the immediate commencement of our facility expansion, funded by our bridge financing, we project readiness for European market entry by Q4 of next year. We believe this is not just an opportunity for Innovate, but a paradigm-shifting moment for the industry. A murmur of assent went around the table. Mr. Dubois, the lead investor from Veyron, smiled for the first time. An impressive and ambitious plan, Miss Vance. We are very encouraged. Richard beamed, looking as if he had just won the lottery. Isabel's smile was pure, uncut triumph. She was about to thank them when the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung silently open. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway was Liam. He was not the Liam they knew. Gone was the quiet, unassuming architect in soft knit sweaters and casual slacks. The man in the doorway was wearing a bespoke, charcoal gray suit that fit him with the kind of perfection that whispers, rather than shouts, its expense. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. His hair was perfectly styled, and on his wrist was a simple, elegant Patek Philippe watch that was worth more than the car Isabel had bought him. He looked like he owned the building, not just lived in one of its apartments. Beside him stood David Chen, holding a slim leather briefcase, his expression professionally neutral. Isabel's face went through a rapid series of transformations: confusion, then irritation, then outright fury and embarrassment. "Liam?" she hissed, her voice a sharp, shocked whisper that cut through the room's calm. "What on earth are you doing here? This is a private, closed-door meeting. You have to leave. Now." Her words were a command, the tone she might use with an errant employee who had wandered into the wrong room. It was the last and greatest miscalculation of her life. Liam's eyes met hers. There was no anger in them, no malice. There was only a calm, profound finality. He stepped into the room, his presence seeming to shrink the space around him. "On the contrary, Isabel," he said, his voice not loud, but carrying a weight that made everyone at the table sit up straighter. "As the primary and majority stakeholder in this company, I believe my presence is not only appropriate, it is required." The statement landed, simple, devastating, final. A stunned silence descended upon the room. The air crackled with disbelief. Richard was the first to break it, letting out a strangled, incredulous laugh. "Stakeholder? What in God's name are you talking about, Liam? Have you lost your mind? Get him out of here, Izzy." Isabel was frozen, her face pale, staring at Liam as if seeing him for the first time. The Veyron investors exchanged wary, confused glances. The carefully constructed reality of the room had just been fractured. Liam didn't even look at Richard. His gaze remained locked on his wife. "You have been operating under a series of false assumptions, Isabel, about your company, about me, about us. I think it's time for some clarity." David Chen stepped forward, calm and efficient. He opened his briefcase and began placing a series of thin, elegantly bound folders in front of each person at the table: the board members, Richard, and the Veyron Group. He placed the last one directly in front of Isabel. The cover was a simple, stark white. "What is this?" she whispered, her hand hovering over the folder, afraid to touch it. That, Liam said, his voice resonating with the quiet authority he had held in reserve for so long, is the truth. He walked slowly to the head of the table, the spot Isabel had just vacated, and stood there. He was no longer the consort, the accessory, the man who kept the home fires burning. He was the center of gravity, and everyone in the room was caught in his pull. "Please," Liam said to the assembled group, "open the folders." The quiet bomb had detonated. Now the fallout would begin. The rustle of paper was the only sound in the boardroom as 12 pairs of hands opened the white folders. Inside, the story was laid out with cold, irrefutable precision. It began with the first document, the Articles of Incorporation for a private equity firm named Orion Holdings. The second was a statement of ownership, declaring Liam Alistair Vance as the sole director and beneficiary. Isabel's breath hitched. She stared at the name, her own husband's name, linked to a company she had never heard of. A wave of cognitive dissonance washed over her. It made no sense. Richard scoffed, flipping through the pages dismissively. "What is this nonsense? Some shell company? Liam, this is pathetic. Are you trying to pretend you're some kind of secret millionaire?" Liam ignored him, his focus entirely on the proceedings. "If you will turn to tab B," he said, his voice as steady as a surgeon's hand, "you will find the initial funding prospectus for Innovate, drafted in May of 2 years ago." Isabel's blood ran cold. It was her prospectus, her words, her vision. But as she looked closer, she saw faint, pencil-thin annotations in the margins of the scanned copy. Questions about scalability, suggestions for alternative revenue models. She recognized the handwriting. It was Liam's. From those late nights in his old apartment, nights she had dismissed as him simply being a supportive boyfriend, a sounding board for her genius. "And at tab C," Liam's voice continued, relentless, "you will see the executed investment agreement. A $2 million seed investment into Innovate." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. "The investor of record is, as you all know, an anonymous venture capital firm, the one Isabel has often praised for its foresight." He looked directly at her, and for the first time she saw not love, not disappointment, but the cool, appraising gaze of a banker examining a defaulted loan. The name of that firm, as you can now see, was Orion Holdings. A collective gasp went through the room. The Veyron investors stared at the paperwork, then at Liam, then at Isabel, their faces hardening into masks of professional neutrality. The board members looked utterly bewildered, their loyalty instantly unmoored. Isabel felt the floor drop out from beneath her. The narrative of her life, the story she told herself, the story she told the world, was disintegrating before her eyes. The brilliant, self-made woman, the bootstrap success. It was all a lie. She hadn't been discovered by a discerning venture capitalist. She had been funded by her quiet, unassuming boyfriend, who had then become her husband. The man she had just tried to eject from the room like a trespasser. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, that's not possible." "It is not only possible, it is the foundational truth of this company," Liam stated, his voice ringing with an authority that could not be questioned. He began to pace slowly, his presence dominating the room. "I believed in your idea, Isabel. I believed in you. I wanted to see you succeed on your own terms, without the shadow of my family's wealth or my name. So I created a vehicle to give you that chance, anonymously. I gave you the capital, the strategic advice you asked for, and then I stepped back to let you build your dream." He stopped and looked at her, his face a mask of profound, weary sorrow. This was the moral mirror, and her reflection in it was ugly. "You built an empire, it's true, but you built it on a foundation I provided, a foundation you never once bothered to inspect. You were so enamored with the view from the top, you forgot to check who was holding the ladder." He then turned his attention to Richard. "You asked what I knew of high finance, Richard. The answer is, I know enough to have turned a significant inheritance into a portfolio that could buy and sell this company 50 times over. I know enough to recognize a leveraged risk when I see one. And I know that a CEO who leverages a primary investor's personal assets as collateral without his knowledge has committed a catastrophic breach of fiduciary duty. Richard's face, which had been red with bluster, was now draining to a pasty, sickly white. The Veyron investors were already quietly closing their folders. Mr. Dubois looked at Liam with a newfound, sharp respect. Finally, Liam's gaze returned to his wife. Her face was a ruin of shattered pride and dawning horror. The prenup, the public humiliation, the constant, subtle belittling. Every memory was now recast in the horrifying light of this new reality. She hadn't been protecting her fortune from a potential gold digger. She had been scorning the very source of that fortune. Her prudence was, in fact, an act of spectacular, self-destructive arrogance. "You wanted to protect your assets from the man you married," Liam said, his voice softening, not with pity, but with the quiet devastation of a final judgment. "It never occurred to you to ask where those assets came from. You demanded a prenup to protect a castle that I built for you, and then you ridiculed me for not understanding the architecture." He let the silence hang in the air, a testament to her folly. He then straightened up, his brief moment of personal reflection over. He was all business now. "Therefore," he announced to the stunned room, "as the majority shareholder, exercising my rights under the Articles of Incorporation you'll find at tab F, I am calling for an immediate vote of no confidence in the current CEO, Ms. Isabel Vance, and the chairman, Mr. Richard Croft. The expansion plan is on hold indefinitely, pending a full audit. This meeting is adjourned." The world tilted on its axis. Isabel stared, mute and broken, as Mr. Dubois from the Veyron Group stood up, gave Liam a crisp, formal nod, and led his team out of the room without a single backward glance at her. Her global expansion, her triumph, her future, it had all evaporated in the space of 10 minutes. The boardroom, which moments before had been a chamber of triumph, was now a tomb. The remaining board members avoided her gaze, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning fear, as they realized whose side they needed to be on. Richard had collapsed into his chair, looking suddenly old and frail, his blustering facade completely stripped away. Isabel finally found her voice, a desperate, strangled sound. She stumbled toward Liam, her hand outstretched. "Liam, I didn't know," she pleaded, tears finally breaking free and streaming down her face. "I swear I had no idea." Liam looked at her, his beautiful, brilliant, broken wife. The love he had felt for her was still there, a ghost limb that ached with a phantom pain. But it was overwhelmed by the vast, cold emptiness of her betrayal. He didn't look at her with hatred. He looked at her with a profound, soul-crushing disappointment that was infinitely worse. "That's the point, Isabel," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You didn't know, and you didn't care to know, and that has made all the difference." He turned, and with David Chen at his side, he walked out of the boardroom, leaving her alone in the wreckage of the kingdom she had thought was hers. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind him, the silence they left in their wake as absolute as a final judgment. In the immediate aftermath, a chilling silence descended upon Innovate. The news of the aborted meeting and the stunning revelation of Liam's ownership ripped through the company's upper echelons like a shockwave. Emails flew, hushed conversations took place in corridors, and a palpable sense of fear replaced the arrogant swagger that had defined the company's culture under Isabel. The expansion was dead, the Veyron deal was dust, and Isabel Vance, the visionary CEO, was suddenly a ghost in her own headquarters. She had stumbled out of the boardroom in a daze, her father Richard trailing behind her, muttering nonsensically. The board members who had once hung on her every word now scattered like birds, their survival instincts overriding any sense of loyalty. They knew a coup when they saw one, and the new king was Liam Vance. The first official communication came less than an hour later. An email from David Chen's law firm, sent to the entire board and senior management, formally announced an emergency board meeting for the following morning. The agenda was simple: to address corporate leadership and fiduciary governance. It was a clinical, bloodless execution. Isabel spent the rest of the day in her office, the office with the panoramic view that now felt like a prison cell. She tried calling Liam, but his phone went straight to voicemail. She left a string of increasingly desperate messages, babbling apologies, pleas for understanding, a torrent of words that couldn't begin to fill the chasm that had opened between them. He never called back. That evening, the house was cavernous and cold. The white marble floors seemed to echo every footstep, amplifying the crushing emptiness. Liam wasn't there. His car was gone. A few of his things, a suit, his drafting tools, the encrypted laptop, were missing from his study. He had packed a small bag and left. He had surgically excised himself from their shared life without a word. The next morning, Isabel was formally voted out as CEO. It was unanimous. Richard was stripped of his chairmanship with the same brutal efficiency. The board, seeing the mountain of evidence David Chen had presented, and understanding that their own futures depended on aligning with the true power, capitulated completely. In the space of 24 hours, Isabel had gone from being the queen of her own universe to a pariah. Her father, his vicarious power obliterated, seemed to shrink before her eyes, becoming just a loud, foolish old man. A week later, the house was still a mausoleum of their dead marriage. Isabel moved through it like a specter, her grief and shame a physical weight. Her mother, Eleanor, came to stay, ostensibly to offer comfort. She found Isabel in the vast living room, staring blankly at the dark city skyline. "This is a nightmare," Isabel whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "How could he do this, to humiliate me like that, in front of everyone?" Eleanor, ever the enabler, rushed to her daughter's defense. "It was cruel, darling, unforgivably cruel. He could have told you in private. To stage such a spectacle, it was vengeful." She stroked Isabel's hair. "He never appreciated you. We all saw it." From the doorway, a quiet voice cut through the comforting lies. "Did you?" Both women turned. Liam was standing there, his face impassive. He had let himself in with his own key. Eleanor stood up, flustered but defiant. "Liam, you can't just walk in here. What you did to her was monstrous." Liam's gaze was like ice. He didn't look at Isabel. He looked directly at her mother. "Monstrous? Was it monstrous when you sat at your dinner table and watched your husband mock my profession? Was it monstrous when you smiled politely while your daughter reduced me to a domestic servant in front of her business partners? You talk of my spectacle. For the last year, my life has been a spectacle of your family's design. I was the court jester in your daughter's kingdom, and you all applauded the performance." He took a step into the room. "You stood by and watched, Eleanor. You never said a word. You never once defended the man your daughter chose to marry. Your silence was its own form of cruelty. This isn't just about Isabel's actions. It's about a culture of disrespect that you all nurtured, watered, and applauded. You are as much a part of this as she is." Eleanor recoiled as if struck, her face paling. There was no defense against the truth of his words. She had been the silent enabler, the purveyor of quiet smiles that validated every insult. Finally, Liam turned his gaze to Isabel. The anger was gone, replaced by a vast, empty sadness. She looked up at him, her face swollen, her eyes pleading. And for the first time, the dam of her arrogance and self-delusion truly broke. "He's right," she choked out, looking at her mother. "He's right. It's all my fault." The confession was a torrent, a flood of pent-up insecurity and shame she had hidden even from herself. "I was so afraid," she sobbed, her words tumbling over one another. "Afraid of not being enough. When the company took off, It was the first time I felt important, powerful. And Dad, he kept telling me I had to protect it, that people would try to take it from me. I was so desperate to feel like I built it all by myself, I pushed away the one person who helped me the most. She looked at Liam, her heart in her eyes. I loved being the son, Liam. I loved the feeling of you orbiting me. It made me feel safe. I was so insecure, so terrified of being just ordinary, that when I finally had something extraordinary, I became a monster to protect it. I see that now. I see everything. I am so, so sorry. It was not an excuse. It was a confession. Raw, honest, and utterly devastating. It was the first truly authentic thing she had said to him in months. Liam listened, his expression unchanging. He had wanted this admission. He had wanted her to see the truth. But now that it was here, it brought him no satisfaction, only a profound sense of waste. The love they might have had, the partnership they could have built, all of it had been sacrificed on the altar of her ego. An apology, no matter how sincere, couldn't rebuild the ruins. It could only acknowledge who had set the fire. The week following the confrontation at the house was one of grim, methodical transition. Liam, working closely with David Chen and the now subservient board, began the process of stabilizing Innovate. His first act as the de facto head was not one of vengeance, but of shrewd business. He knew the company itself, the core idea he had helped nurture, was still brilliant. Its value had been compromised not by a flawed product, but by flawed leadership. His goal was never to destroy his own investment, but to correct its course. He convened the board, this time in a rented, neutral conference room, far from the tainted grandeur of Isabel's former office. He laid out his plan with the same quiet precision he used to design buildings. He wasn't a tech visionary, and he didn't pretend to be. He was a strategist, an owner. Innovate needs a leader who understands the market and can command respect both internally and externally, he stated. He then slid a folder across the table. I've spent the last week vetting candidates. My recommendation for interim CEO is Sarah Jenkins. The board members were stunned. Sarah Jenkins was Innovate's chief technology officer, a brilliant but unassuming woman whom Isabel had often overshadowed, taking credit for many of Sarah's technical breakthroughs. She was respected by the engineers and feared by the sales team for her brutal honesty. She was, in short, the anti-Isabel. By promoting her, Liam was sending a clear message. The age of image was over. The age of substance had begun. The motion passed unanimously. His next meeting was with Richard. He met him not in a boardroom, but in a small, sterile coffee shop near Richard's home. The older man, stripped of his vicarious power and his daughter's wealth, looked diminished. The expensive suit hung on him differently, the confident bluster replaced by a nervous, twitching energy. He tried to open with an apology, a rambling, self-serving attempt to recast his behavior. Liam cut him off. "I'm not here to discuss your feelings, Richard," Liam said, his tone flat. "I'm here to discuss facts." He placed a single sheet of paper on the table between them. It was a summary of Richard's personal finances, which David had procured with unnerving speed. "Your consulting business has been running at a net loss for 3 years. You have 2 mortgages, and you've leveraged your portfolio to its absolute limit. The family money you were so keen to protect was a fiction. You were counting on Isabel's success to bail you out." The power dynamic was now completely, brutally inverted. The man who had mocked Liam's quaint career was being confronted with the reality of his own failure. Richard stared at the paper, his face ashen. "What Isabel built was real," Richard sputtered weakly. "What Isabel built was funded by me," Liam corrected him calmly, "and you encouraged her to treat me with contempt. You coached her in the art of arrogance. You did this not just to protect her, but to protect yourself. Your access to her success was your retirement plan." He leaned forward slightly. "That access is now terminated. You will have no further role, official or unofficial, with the company. Any attempt to contact the board or influence my wife will be met with consequences. Are we clear? Richard could only nod, a broken man. The reversal of fortune was absolute. The humiliator was now the one humiliated, not with a public spectacle, but with a quiet, devastating exposure of the truth. Finally, he had to see Isabel. He found her in the house packing boxes. The minimalist furniture and expensive art were being shrouded in dust covers. The house was being sold. She looked up when he entered, her face pale but her eyes clear for the first time in a long time. There were no more tears. They stood in the echoing living room, the space between them filled with the ghosts of what might have been. "The house is sold," she said, her voice a monotone. "The money will cover the penalties for breaking the loan agreement. There will be almost nothing left over." "I know," he said. "I'm filing for divorce," he stated, not as a question or a threat, but as a simple fact. "I've instructed my lawyer to draw up the papers." She nodded, accepting it. "The prenup," she began. "The prenup will be honored to the letter," Liam said, the final, crushing irony hanging in the air. "It stipulates that in the event of a divorce, all assets held by Innovate remain your separate property. What's yours is yours." He paused. "Of course, your assets now consist of a minority, non-voting stake in a company that I control completely. Your shares are essentially illiquid. You won't be able to sell them without board approval, which is to say, my approval. Your grand fortune has become a paper prison." She finally looked at him, a flicker of the old fire in her eyes, but it was a fire of understanding, not anger. "You thought of everything." "An architect always considers the entire structure," he replied, "the stresses, the loads, the potential points of failure." He took a step closer, his voice softening, not with affection, but with a final, painful clarity. "This was never about the money, Isabel. Not for me. I would have given you everything, freely and gladly. All I ever wanted in return was your respect, a partnership. You wanted a kingdom with a subject. My love for you was never conditional. Your respect for me was, and you failed the condition." He placed a key on the marble countertop, his key to the house. "Goodbye, Isabel." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty hall. He didn't look back. He was leaving behind the ruins of a life he had tried to build, but he was walking toward a future where he could finally build something for himself, on solid ground. 6 months passed. The seasons changed, washing the city in the cool, clear light of autumn. For Liam, it was a time of quiet reconstruction. He had resigned from his position at the large architectural firm, using his own capital to launch a smaller, boutique practice with 2 trusted colleagues. Their focus was not on gleaming corporate towers or monuments to wealth, but on projects with purpose. A beautifully designed public library for a low-income neighborhood, a sustainable community housing project, a serene and thoughtful cancer hospice. He poured his energy into creating spaces that serve people, finding a deep, quiet satisfaction in the work that Richard had once called quaint. He was still an immensely wealthy man, but his wealth was no longer a secret or a burden. It was a tool, one he used to build a life of meaning, far from the toxic glare of Isabel's world. He was at peace. He worked late, not out of obligation, but out of passion. He spent his weekends hiking in the mountains north of the city, feeling the solid earth beneath his feet. The anger had dissipated, leaving behind not a scar, but a smooth, hard surface of wisdom. He had learned the true cost of loving someone who was incapable of seeing you. One crisp Saturday afternoon, while sketching in a small park, he saw her. It was Isabel. He almost didn't recognize her. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by simple jeans and a practical coat. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore very little makeup. She was working at a small outdoor coffee cart, taking an order from a customer, her hands deftly managing the espresso machine. She looked thinner, and there was a tiredness around her eyes. But there was also something new in her expression, a calmness, a lack of pretense. When she handed the customer their coffee, she smiled. It wasn't the dazzling, high-wattage smile she had used for magazine covers and investors. It was a small, genuine smile, the smile of a person simply doing a job. As she turned to wipe down the counter, her eyes briefly met his across the park. There was a flicker of recognition, a moment of shared history that passed between them in an instant. There was no anger, no pleading. She simply held his gaze for a second, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement and turned back to her work. In that quiet nod, Liam saw the beginning of her long road to redemption. She was starting over, from the ground up, without the crutch of his money or her father's ambition. She was learning to be just Isabel, not Isabel Vance, CEO. He felt a pang, not of regret, but of a distant, melancholy hope for her. Her journey was her own, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that it was a journey she had to take alone. He closed his sketchbook, stood up, and walked away, leaving her to her new life, just as she had left him to his. The story of Liam and Isabel became a quiet legend in the city's business circles, a cautionary tale whispered over expensive lunches. They spoke of the arrogant CEO and her quiet, unassuming husband who turned out to be a financial titan. They spoke of the public humiliation and the even more spectacular, silent revenge. But they missed the point. The true story was not about money or revenge. It was about the fundamental nature of respect. True worth cannot be measured by stock prices or magazine features. It resides in character, in integrity. The loudest voice in the room is so often the most insecure, shouting to drown out its own doubt. Real strength, Liam had learned, is a quiet fortress. It doesn't need to announce its presence. It simply endures. It withstands the siege of arrogance and the erosion of contempt. And when the time is right, it reveals its power not in a roar, but in the calm, irrefutable statement of the truth. Patience and integrity, he now knew, will always eventually triumph over the fleeting victory of a prideful heart. Redemption is possible, but it is not a gift to be given. It is a wage to be earned through the hard labor of humility. It's a powerful lesson on the difference between appearance and reality. What do you think? Was Liam's response justified, or was it a cold revenge served best for his own satisfaction? We'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of life, loss, and the quiet pursuit of justice. Until next time, remember to value the quiet ones. They're the ones who are truly listening.